Hello there, and welcome to Obscure Chronicle. This is a quiet corner of the internet where forgotten stories linger and history whispers softly through time. Here, we slow down. We explore the past gently through mysteries, letters, ruins, and memories half remembered. So tonight, or whenever you've chosen to join me, you're invited to rest, to listen, to let your mind wander into quieter centuries. If you enjoy this kind of storytelling, the kind that unfolds slowly, that values the forgotten, the ordinary, and the unexplained, then I'd love to have you stay. Just a quick note, over 70% of viewers who watch these stories aren't subscribed yet. If you find comfort in this kind of quiet history, I'd be truly grateful if you'd consider subscribing. It helps Obscure Chronicle grow and lets you know when the next story is ready. Now, find a comfortable place, lower the lights, and let us begin. Tonight's journey through the echoes of Roanoke and the gentle mystery it left behind. The year is 1587. The wind is soft upon the sails, and the Atlantic Ocean stretches out like a grey-blue sheet of glass, its surface barely rippling beneath the wooden hull of a ship called the Lion. Above, gulls circle lazily. The world is quiet here, save for the creak of rope, the sigh of canvas, and the occasional murmurs of tired, sea-worn voices. We begin our journey not with battle or grandeur, but with patience, with the long exhale of a voyage nearing its uncertain end. For over 2 months, the colonists had endured the open sea. They had slept in cramped corners of the ship's hold, rocked gently, then not so gently, by the moods of the Atlantic. Salt had crusted in the folds of their garments. Meals had dwindled to hard biscuits and dried fish. Children grew quiet from boredom, then restless, then quiet again. A baby had been born en route, her cries strangely soft, muffled by the endless lap of waves. She would be named Virginia Dare. Sir Walter Raleigh, the architect of this venture, remained in England. He had been granted a patent by Queen Elizabeth I to establish a colony in the New World, and with his vision and coin, the expedition had been planned. But he would not be the one to endure the crossing, nor would he plant the first gardens or build the first homes. That duty belonged to John White, an artist and cartographer who had once travelled to the region with an earlier expedition. Now he was governor of a colony that existed only in letters and plans, not yet in soil and timber. He was a thoughtful man, reserved but curious, given to moments of quiet sketching in the margins of his logbook. There were roughly 115 souls aboard the Lion, men, women, children, and families. Unlike earlier expeditions, this one was not meant as a military foothold, but as a civilian settlement. It was to be, in theory, the first permanent English colony in the Americas. But there was uncertainty from the beginning. The original plan had been to settle near the Chesapeake Bay, where conditions were rumoured to be more favourable and relations with native peoples more promising. But the privateer captain, Simon Fernandez, who commanded the ship, refused to sail further. He put the colonists ashore at Roanoke Island instead, far to the south. Why he did so remains unknown. Perhaps he feared hostile waters. Perhaps supplies were too low. Perhaps there was something he saw that others did not. Whatever his reasons, the Lion dropped anchor near Roanoke in the warm haze of midsummer. The colonists came ashore slowly, stepping gingerly onto damp sand, some falling to their knees, others simply standing still, breathing in land after so many weeks afloat. The island greeted them with a stillness they would come to know well. Tall pines rose in dense stands, their needles catching the breeze with a soft whisper. Palmettos fringed the shore. Inland, brackish marshes gave way to slightly drier ground, where birdsong laced the air like gentle bells. Crabs scuttled from their approach. The sun filtered through the canopy in long, dappled beams, catching on beads of sweat already forming at the napes of necks. There was no fanfare, only the low murmur of tasks beginning. Luggage unloaded, barrels rolled ashore, timbers examined, infants hushed. They found, as they feared, the site of the earlier settlement, abandoned. The bones of houses stood weathered and greyed. A fort's walls, once firm and defiant, sagged like old cloth. Grass had grown up through cracks in walkways. It was as though time had passed more quickly here. The native villages nearby, once home to the Secatan, Roanoke and Croatoan peoples, were quiet too. The colonists did not know why. From the tree line, others were watching. They did not come forward immediately. They had seen ships like this before, and their memory of the white-skinned men was mixed. Curious, cautious, and quietly scarred. To the Algonquian-speaking tribes who had lived in these coastal regions for generations, the reappearance of the English was not a new story, but a continuation of one they did not author. Some among them had remembered the earlier Englishmen. They had brought trinkets, tools, promises, and diseases. They had mapped the land with hungry eyes. They had quarrelled with rival tribes, occasionally aligning with one against another. But they had also brought strange knowledge, metal blades, and foods that fascinated the young. The elders of the Croatoan, who lived further south on Hatteras Island, debated what it meant that the English had returned. Some advocated contact, cautious, gentle. Others warned that hospitality, once offered and misused, should not be extended again. From the thick reeds of the marsh, a boy no older than 10 crouched beside his older sister. He watched the new settlers as they unloaded their wagons and stretched canvas between poles. Their clothes looked stiff, their gestures unfamiliar. He did not speak, only studied them. His sister whispered the word weroance, softly, chieftain, a name for the leader among the pale newcomers. She wondered aloud which one he might be. The first fire was lit in the ruins of the old fort. It was small, meant to conserve kindling and avoid smoke that might draw the wrong kind of attention. Around it, the settlers gathered, tired, sore, unsure of what would come next. John White recorded their arrival in his log with a restrained hand. His drawings from that first evening show little emotion, just structure, a shoreline, the curve of a ship's hull, the outline of a pine. His daughter, Eleanor, cradled her infant. Others laid out blankets, unpacked kettles, and fed chickens that clucked disorientedly at their feet. They ate boiled lentils and flatbread, passed around slowly. Someone began to hum, a faint English melody, lost to time. Above them the stars were unfamiliar, brighter, closer, and in the distance unseen eyes blinked behind the brush. The days that followed moved like silt in water, slow, dense, patient. Timber was gathered. Simple homes were framed using the skeletons of those left behind. A well was cleared and deepened. The colonists mapped the surrounding area with cautious optimism. They avoided native villages at first, unsure of where friendship stood. But a few among them, especially those who'd come with Raleigh's earlier expeditions, remembered names and places. One man recalled Manteo, a Croatoan who'd once travelled all the way to England and returned with stories of vast cities and strange foods. There were no immediate threats, no arrows from the trees, no open hostility. But there was a thickness in the air, a silence too constant to feel natural. The forest observed them. The wind carried no messages. Still, the colonists worked. A woman kneaded dough beneath the shelter of leaves. Her son swept the dirt floor with a pine branch. A man mended a fishing net using thread salvaged from a worn cloak. In the background, the steady rasp of saw against log filled the air with rhythm. In another corner of the island, a Croatoan elder stood ankle-deep in the water, feeling for fish with his bare hands. He stared north toward the English encampment, his face unreadable, his breath shallow. This was meant to be a new beginning, a colony not just for trade or military outposts, but for families, for permanence. John White, reflecting in his journal, wrote sparingly of his hopes. He did not overstate their prospects, but he wrote one line: "We shall begin anew, and we shall be quiet about it," that captures the essence of that first week. There was no conquest in their steps, only determination. No thunder of battle, only the slow weaving of days. The land did not welcome them, nor did it reject them. It simply existed, an ancient rhythm continuing beneath their footsteps, within the winds, under the sleeping pines. As night falls again, we leave the colony in candlelight. A mother hums a lullaby in the hush of her home, the baby quiet against her chest. Across the bay and the darkness of the forest, a Croatoan youth peers up at the same moon and wonders what morning will bring. Tomorrow, the settlement will begin to reach outward. Gardens will be planted. Signals will be sent. The waiting will begin. But for now, the air is still, and the mystery is only just beginning. The earth was damp from an early rain. Puddles lay like mirrors across the footpaths that wound around the small growing settlement. Above, the sky hung low, heavy, slate-coloured and silent. It had been several days since the colonists had come ashore at Roanoke Island. Their task continued with quiet determination. Yet beneath each chore, gathering kindling, planting beans, reinforcing walls, there was the same unspoken question. Who else still walked these woods? They had not yet met them, not truly. But the feeling of being watched had grown into a near certainty. At the edge of every clearing, where tree roots curled like fingers through the loam, shadows lingered just a little longer than they should have. And then, at last, the first figures appeared, not as threats, but as observers. They did not speak, not at first. It began at dawn. The air was wet and cool. Mist curled over the undergrowth like breath. A young colonist named Robert Tillman, no more than 20, had gone into the woods to collect fallen branches for cooking fires. He carried a dull hatchet slung over his shoulder and whistled softly as he walked. He was not far from the main settlement when he stopped, sensing more than seeing another presence. In the silence that followed, even the birds seemed to hush. Then, through the trees, just beyond a cluster of white pine, he saw them. 3 figures, still as stones. One stood tall and straight, with long black hair tied behind his head and a staff in one hand. The others were smaller, perhaps adolescents, wrapped in woven cloth, their eyes fixed on him. They said nothing. Neither did Robert. Instead, he slowly lowered his hatchet, letting the blade rest gently against the earth. His hands remained open, empty. He did not run. He did not speak. And as suddenly as they had appeared, the watchers slipped back into the trees, their movement no louder than leaves turning in the wind. When Robert returned to the settlement, he said only, "I saw them." And then he went to sit by the fire, gazing into the coals, wordless. To the Croatoan, the English were not new. Their elders still remembered the first visits, strange vessels with great white wings arriving along the coast, carrying pale men who gestured with open hands and spoke words no one understood. They had come bearing copper trinkets and iron blades, offering gifts and curiosity. In time, there had been friendship with some. Manteo was one of them, a Croatoan who had travelled across the sea to England itself, where buildings touched the sky and smoke rose from every rooftop. He had seen their queen, their cities, their crowded markets. He had returned home changed. Now he stood at the edge of the inlet, gazing toward Roanoke once again. He knew these new settlers were not soldiers, not entirely. Thus are women among them, children. These were not men of war, at least not as the Croatoan understood war. Still, the past hung heavy. Earlier English expeditions had brought conflict with other tribes, chiefly the Secatan and their neighbours. When alliances shifted, when supplies dwindled, tempers rose. Some native communities had suffered violence, others disease. The balance between hospitality and harm was fragile. So the Croatoan waited. They watched, they remembered, and they prepared to approach again, carefully. It was Manteo who made the first peaceful contact as he had done years before. He arrived at the edge of the English settlement not long after the forest sighting, accompanied by two others who stood respectfully behind him. He carried no weapon, only a carved walking stick and a small bundle of woven cloth. John White emerged to greet him, his face a mixture of surprise and quiet relief. He recognized Manteo immediately. Though it had been some time, the Croatoan's presence brought back memories of earlier expeditions, of calm conversations and thoughtful exchanges. Their words were broken, hesitant, part Algonquian, part English, part gesture. But understanding came slowly, like dawn over misted hills. Manteo offered gifts, dried fish, maize, a gourd of sweet water. In return, White presented a length of fine blue cloth, a copper bracelet and a flint knife. There was no ceremony, only a patient exchange, deliberate and slow like the turning of seasons. The colonists gathered nearby, watching quietly. Some bowed their heads, others offered shy smiles. Children peered from behind their mothers' skirts, fascinated by Manteo's dark hair, his bear claw necklace, the rhythm of his speech. Manteo spoke of the Croatoan people, of their island south of Roanoke, of the shifting alliances among the tribes. He spoke too of the Secatan, once friendly, now wary, of tensions lingering like smoke in the trees, and then, as gently as he'd arrived, he turned and left. But the bridge had been laid. In the days that followed, cautious meetings unfolded. Members of the Croatoan visited the settlement in small groups, never more than 3 or 4 at a time. They stayed to the edges, beneath the long shadows of pines, and observed. The colonists, too, were slow to engage. There were no formal negotiations, no declarations of alliance. Instead, there were glances, nods, small offerings of dried berries or handmade charms. At one point, a Croatoan woman named Witcher saw a young English girl struggling to carry a bucket of water from the well. She stepped forward, silently, and took the other handle. Together, they lifted the bucket, each watching the other with wide, searching eyes. No words were spoken, but the girl smiled and the woman nodded once before stepping away. It was a small moment, but such moments are the foundations of trust. Communication between the two groups grew gradually. John White began drawing pictures, simple images of the sun, trees, birds, and faces. He held them up one by one, pointing, asking gently for names. Manteo and others obliged. A heron became Wishakn. The moon was Kesuk. Fire, Tinde. In turn, the colonists shared English words. slowly, syllable by syllable, house, friend, water, peace. Children from both communities proved the most fearless. A Croatoan boy once wandered into the edge of the English settlement chasing a frog. 2 colonial girls offered him a biscuit. He sat and ate in silence, then left without a word. But the next day he returned, this time with a carved shell for them. Small gestures, tiny exchanges, each one building a fragile web of understanding across a chasm of difference. Not all moments passed without confusion. One afternoon, a group of Croatoan visitors observed a ritual among the colonists, a prayer gathering, held at the edge of the camp near the water. The English bowed their heads, muttered in Latin and English, and passed a cup from hand to hand. The Croatoan did not understand the words, but they watched with reverence. Later, one man mimicked the posture in a moment of jest among his own people, kneeling, head bowed, muttering nonsense syllables. To him, it was light-hearted curiosity, but a passing colonist saw it, misunderstood, and walked away in quiet offence. It took several days for the air to clear, for Matteo to explain that no insult had been meant, and it passed. But it was a reminder. Peace required patience, always. Between these interactions, life settled into rhythm once more. The colonists turned their attention to survival, planting crops, digging ditches, repairing old structures. The Croatoan returned often to Hatteras Island, though Matteo remained nearby. Evenings on Roanoke were marked by quiet fires, the hush of wind in the reeds, and the distant call of owls. Sometimes distant drums echoed faintly across the water. Not loud, not threatening, merely a heartbeat in the night. No one knew their meaning, but the colonists listened, and the forest listened too. Though Croatoan visitors had become a cautious presence, the Sekatan did not come. Their villages, once within walking distance, remained empty or hostile. Scouts reported signs of movement, smoke rising through distant trees, canoes drawn ashore and then gone again, but no direct contact. John White worried quietly. He remembered the Sekatan from his earlier voyage, proud, organised, cautious. Their absence now spoke volumes. Matteo warned that relations between the Sekatan and English had frayed during the last expedition, especially after a conflict that had ended with a native leader's death. The colonists debated whether to send envoys, but for now they waited. The wind carried no word from the Sekatan lands. One of the settlers, a woman named Agnes, gave birth to a son. It was a quiet affair, attended only by 2 midwives. The child was born healthy, with a shock of dark hair and wide blue eyes. They named him Thomas. News of the birth reached the Croatoan quickly. In their culture, the arrival of a child held great significance, a sign of peace, continuity, blessing. When Matteo next came to visit, he brought a small token for the newborn, an amulet carved from bone, meant to ward off illness. It was accepted with grace. In the face of uncertainty, the smallest things carried the most meaning. As the month wore on, a stillness settled over Roanoke. The first encounters had passed without conflict, but beneath the calm lay questions, quiet, persistent, unanswered. What had become of the old settlement's occupants? Why had the Sekatan gone silent? And what lay deeper in the woods, where the trees grew too thick for light to pass? These were not fears, not yet, only wonderings. For now there was peace, a fragile one, built on nods and borrowed words, shared laughter and silent gestures. But even in stillness, the forest listened, and beyond the trees the future waited, unseen but approaching. In the darkness of the second month, the moon rises quietly above Roanoke. The colonists sleep in homes of rough timber and canvas. Across the water, the Croatoan prepare offerings for their ancestors. Two worlds, circling slowly around each other, bound by curiosity, patience, and the fragile hope of understanding. In the pale hush of early morning, before the wind stirred the seagrass, and before the birds began their whispering chorus, the colony stirred to life. The sun did not rise with sudden brilliance. Instead, it crept up over the water, slow and steady, casting long shadows across the clearing where the settlers had begun, carefully and cautiously to build. This was not a city, not a fortress. It was not even yet a village. It was something smaller, quieter, a handful of people trying to make the shape of home from the edge of wilderness, and every piece of earth they turned, every timber they raised, was done with the knowledge that they were not alone. The forest watched them. The Croatoan walked nearby, and the wind carried the memory of those who had vanished before. When the decision was made to return to Roanoke rather than press farther north toward the Chesapeake Bay, as Raleigh's advisers had once urged, the colonists knew they were re-entering familiar ground. But familiarity did not make it easy. The remnants of the previous settlement remained like ghosts, faint outlines of crumbled walls, fire-darkened stones, old iron nails rusting where cottages had once stood. The land was wild again. Vines had claimed the walkways, shrubs bloomed where there had once been gardens, saplings poked through floorboards. Still they found enough cleared land, enough memory. The colonists worked slowly at first, mindful of the heat and wary of sudden storms. They formed work crews of 3 or 4, one to dig, another to cut timber, another to haul water from the nearby stream. The forest offered plenty of trees, longleaf pine, red oak, and hickory. Each cut was made with deliberation, and always with a kind of silent apology. They tried not to take more than they needed. John White, ever the observer, spent hours sketching the land before any structure rose. He noted the slope of the ground, the way the rainwater gathered, the flight paths of birds. He walked in quiet circles, murmuring to himself, planning not a city but a breathing thing, a living place that could grow gently into the land, not crush it. They built in small groups, a few homes at a time. No walls were raised around the colony. Whether out of trust or necessity, it remained open. The homes they constructed were modest, even by the standards of Elizabethan England. Rectangular structures, no more than 15 feet long and 10 feet wide, made of upright timber beams, mud-plastered walls, and thatched roofs woven from marsh grasses and reeds. The work was slow, but the rhythm was soothing. Each beam lifted required 3 sets of hands, 2 to hold, 1 to hammer. Children carried tools. Older settlers sat and prepared reeds for binding. The entire colony became a chorus of motion, pulling, lifting, thatching, shaping. As they worked, a kind of companionship formed. It was not born of festivity or feasting, but of sweat, of silence, of sharing space. A woman named Margaret Hayes worked alongside her husband, George, mixing clay and straw into thick daub to coat the outer walls of their dwelling. Her fingers, always so soft in England, became rough and red with the work. And yet, she smiled. "This place will hold warmth," she said softly, pressing her palm against the drying wall, "even if it is only ours for a little while." Each family shaped their space a little differently. Some kept shelves for herbs and tools, others laid pine boughs over the floors, which released a clean, sharp scent when walked upon. All left a small opening at the roof's peak for smoke to rise, a chimney not yet possible with the tools they had brought. At night, the flickering of fires inside those first homes sent gentle light dancing against the trees. It was not safety, but it was shelter. There was no greater symbol of life than the hearth. More than walls, more than roofs, it was the fire that made a place feel whole. Every morning, women and older children kindled small flames, coaxing sparks from flint and steel, feeding dry moss into soft tongues of flame. The scent of smoke mingled with the salt air. Embers glowed like slow-burning stars. The hearth was where bread was baked, where fish was dried, where small pots of soup made from wild greens, native beans, and leftover salt pork simmered for hours. Families gathered around the fire not only to cook but to speak, to rest, to remember England. Stories were shared, softly, almost whispered. Some were humorous, others quiet recollections of gardens, markets, church bells. And as the younger children drifted into sleep, elders hummed lullabies that carried more memory than melody. Sometimes a Croatoan visitor would sit nearby, listening with head bowed. They did not always understand the words, but the tone was universal. The hearth did not belong to the English alone. It was a human thing. By mid-season, the settlers had begun planting in earnest. At first, they followed the methods they knew. Rows of peas, onions, cabbages brought from seed, and beans planted in tidy lines. But the earth did not always cooperate. The soil was sandy, too dry in some places, too wet in others. And so, they began watching the Croatoan more carefully, observing how they planted corn in mounds, mixing it with beans and squash to share nutrients, preserve moisture, and repel pests. A woman named Anne Dare, whose own daughter, Virginia, had just begun walking, adopted the method in her small garden space. Her maize grew tall and golden under the sun, far healthier than the rows she had sown by English practice. It was a quiet lesson in humility. One morning she offered part of her harvest back to a visiting Croatoan woman. They exchanged no words, only a gentle nod. The garden had taught them both. The daily sounds of the colony were never loud. There was no shouting, no hammering of stone on stone. Instead, there were quiet creaks of wooden carts, the thump of woven baskets hitting the ground, the swish of brooms over earthen floors. Children played with sticks and stones, their laughter soft, intermittent. A man named Elias carved small spoons from driftwood in the afternoon light, the rasp of his blade a metronome to the day's calm. And in the distance, the wind rustled tall grasses, reminding all who heard it that the world beyond their tiny clearing remained vast and wild. Even the act of building, a normally noisy endeavour, had been subdued here. The settlers worked with a sort of reverence, as though they knew the land might not tolerate their presence for long. And perhaps, deep down, they understood they were not truly shaping this place. They were merely borrowing space from it. A place of worship was needed, but there were no stained glass windows, no stone bells, no grand pews, and so the settlers chose a clearing where the sun fell in slats between tall pines, and they marked the ground with stones in the shape of a cross. Each Sunday they gathered on logs and blankets, their hands folded, their voices low. Reverend Mark Winslow led prayers not from a pulpit, but from memory. He quoted psalms slowly, letting the words hang between trees. Though the sermons were quiet, they carried weight. Faith here was not triumphant. It was not adorned. It was simply carried, like water in a cracked bowl, spilling sometimes but never abandoned, and every now and then a figure could be seen at the edge of the trees, a Croatoan man or woman watching from afar, hearing English hymns drifting like birdsong through the branches. They did not intrude, and the colonists did not call out. But something passed between them nonetheless. Each evening a few settlers walked to the shore. They stood in the soft hush where land met water, where the sand gave slightly underfoot and sea foam kissed their boots. Here, at the edge of everything, they felt both small and whole. A boy named Nathaniel, no more than 10, collected shells, holding each one up to his ear as though it carried the echo of a voice. He said the round ones sounded like bells, and the spiral ones like wind in a cave. He kept them in a pouch, which he later shared with a Croatoan child, naming each shell aloud. The child listened, then replied with names of their own. They smiled, traded shells, and returned to their homes. Sometimes the sea gave gifts, stranded fish, smooth driftwood, the glint of copper washed ashore. Other times it simply whispered, but it never ignored them. Life was not only labour. In the cool of evening, the settlers sometimes gathered for shared meals. Small gatherings, bowls passed from hand to hand, stories drifting like smoke into the air. One night, Margaret Hayes sang a song she remembered from her girlhood in Kent, a lullaby about geese and rain. Her voice was low, uncertain at first, but as she sang, others joined, and soon the fire circle was wrapped in a melody older than any of them. Even the Croatoan who visited that night said nothing. They only listened. Music, like water, crossed borders easily, and for a few heartbeats there were no settlers, no natives, no fear, no land to claim, only people sharing the twilight. John White kept a careful journal. He sketched the layout of the colony, each path and home, each garden and gathering spot. He noted the growth of beans, the arrival of new birds, the turning of wind. But more than this, he observed people. He noted the patterns of speech among the colonists, the way accents from different parts of England bent into each other, how stress made some more quiet, others more sharp. He noted the expressions of Croatoan guests, the way they listened before speaking, the soft hands they placed on children's heads, the way they looked up at the stars with calmness rather than wonder. In one entry he wrote, "They live as part of this land. We build atop it." He didn't say it with judgment, only with awareness. Weeks passed. The buildings stood, not grand but present. The gardens grew, not abundant but steady. The people lived, not boldly but with patience. This was no conquest, no triumph. It was simply a settlement, a handful of human beings wrapped in wool and hope, trying to remember what it meant to belong somewhere unfamiliar. They had raised walls, yes, but more than that, they had begun to raise lives, and each breath, each step, each humble gesture toward cooperation and care became a stone in the invisible foundation of something sacred. Not a town, not a colony, but a moment, shared, fleeting, and deeply human. The season turned, not all at once, but gradually, like the slow changing of a candle's flame. Mornings grew crisper. The light, though still warm, began to carry a different tone, more golden, more slanted. The air tasted of dry leaves and distant smoke. The trees, once vibrant green, began to flush with rust and ochre. Roanoke, still small, still quiet, pressed onward. But in that quiet, something else began to stir. A shift not loud, not violent, but persistent. Not an event, but a feeling. The kind of feeling that arrives without footsteps, that waits between the hours, that changes the weight of silence. The colony began to sense it, even if they could not name it yet. For weeks, each morning had brought birdsong, sparrows nesting in the reeds, warblers flitting between beams of sun, the slow, swooping call of a mourning dove, so regular that some settlers joked it was the colony's clock. But one morning they awoke to silence. No chirping, no fluttering wings, only the soft hiss of wind moving through grass. At first they thought little of it. Perhaps the birds had migrated, or perhaps a predator had come near, but the stillness lingered. A quiet, not just of birds, but of all things. The woods, too, seemed to hold its breath. The frogs in the marsh, usually so lively near dusk, had gone quiet. Even the crickets sang more faintly. The colonists noticed, but said little. They had other tasks to fill the day. Potatoes to dig, barrels to patch, cords of firewood to stack. But in the space between words and work, they noticed. And some, deep down, began to wonder. Since Manteo's arrival, the Croatoan had visited often. They brought gifts of smoked fish, shared stories, pointed to herbs useful for healing. They joined the colonists at the edge of fire circles, listening, observing, occasionally smiling. But now, their visits grew less frequent. Days passed with no sign of their canoes across the inlet. No tracks in the soft earth outside the settlement. No shared laughter from the tree line. When Manteo did come, he came alone. He offered no explanation. His tone was soft, measured, but his eyes moved more often to the trees, to the sky. He seemed distracted, or perhaps burdened. John White tried gently to ask if something had changed. Manteo only replied, "The land is watching. We must be careful." He would not explain further. That night, he left before the sun set, his figure slowly swallowed by the shadows beneath the forest canopy. He did not return for many days. Margaret Hayes was the first to mention it aloud. She had risen early to collect herbs from the edge of the wood, a place she'd gone many times before. The air was still cool, the light silver, not yet gold. As she bent near a patch of wild mint, she paused. There, standing beyond the first line of trees, was a figure. Not moving, not approaching, just standing. It could have been Croatoan, or someone else. She called out, softly, not with fear, but with politeness. No answer. The figure turned, slowly, and stepped back into the shadows. When she told the others, no one dismissed her. But no one chased the stranger either. What would they say? They were not soldiers. They had no fort, only their firelight and each other. A few days later, a tool went missing. A small iron axe belonging to the blacksmith's assistant. It had been left leaning against a woodpile at dusk. Common, unremarkable. In the morning it was gone. At first it was assumed to be misplaced. A child might have moved it, or it had simply been knocked into the brush. But a careful search found nothing. No tracks, no disturbed soil, no sign of theft. It was not the loss that unsettled them. Tools were scarce, but not irreplaceable. It was the implication. Had someone taken it? Someone watching? Or had it been taken for another reason? Curiosity, necessity. The colonists said little, but from that day on tools were kept closer. Doors were checked twice at night. Fires were watched a little more carefully. Still, there was no panic, only preparation, and the slow blooming of quiet unease. One afternoon the weather changed with unusual speed. The morning had been clear, warm, even cheerful. A small group had ventured westward to gather herbs and scout the edge of the nearby waterway. But by midday, clouds appeared. Not dark at first, but too many, too fast. The air thickened. The smell of rain arrived before a single drop fell. And then, without warning, a wind tore through the settlement, lashing branches, overturning baskets, slamming shutters. The rain followed, heavy and cold. Tents were soaked, tools scattered. A cooking fire hissed out beneath the downpour. It passed quickly, less than an hour. But in its wake, the settlement felt changed. The ground was slick, the air tense, and more than one settler noted that the forest seemed darker, as though the storm had swept something loose from the soil, something older than memory. John White wrote in his journal, "The wind carried more than rain. It stirred the spirits in the trees." Virginia Dare had always been a quiet child, but now she was nearly silent. Eleanor, her mother, noticed it first. The baby, who once cooed and chirped at every face, now simply stared. Her wide blue eyes fixed on corners, on light, on spaces unseen. She cried less, but also laughed less. At night, she would sometimes wake and sit upright, alert, watching the empty room, not with fear, but with recognition. Eleanor said nothing to the others. She only held her daughter closer and began hanging small charms, woven from grass and shell, above her cradle, the way Croatoan mothers had once taught her. Not because she feared spirits, but because the baby seemed to be listening to something no one else could hear. The settlers were careful with their stores. They dried fish, pickled beans, salted pork. Each barrel was sealed, each sack tied, each root cellar kept cool. But something changed. Barrels that had once stayed fresh for weeks now spoiled within days. Meat turned sour. Mould bloomed overnight on bread. No one knew why. The weather had not turned. The seals had not broken. Some whispered of the dampness, of rot in the soil. Others blamed a fungus carried on the wind. But in their eyes was something else, a sense that the land itself was rejecting them, politely, quietly, but firmly, as though it no longer wished to feed them. After 12 days, Manteo returned. His arrival was quiet, just as before, his canoe drawn gently to shore, his steps slow, deliberate. But this time he did not smile. He came alone again, carrying no gifts. John White met him near the edge of the camp. The two men sat beneath the pines and spoke in low voices. Manteo explained, carefully, that some among the Croatoan believed the English had brought something with them. Not a sickness of the body, but something else, an unease, a spirit, a disruption in the balance of the land. He did not accuse, he only observed, and he offered a warning, not of violence, but of distance. The Croatoan, he said, would not return for a while. They needed space, time. John White understood, and said nothing. That night a sound echoed through the woods, soft at first, barely noticeable, a drum. Not the war drum of fearsome stories, but a steady pulsing rhythm, slow, like a heartbeat beneath the soil. It did not move closer, it did not change pace. It simply continued, through the night, into the pale hours before dawn. The colonists did not speak of it the next morning. They only moved more quietly, and listened for it again. By the end of the month, silence had taken shape. It was no longer emptiness. It was a presence. The forest no longer felt like a border, but a veil. The air no longer smelled of salt and pine alone, but of something just beyond naming. And the colonists, still building, still planting, still hoping, began to wonder, more often and more quietly, what it meant that they were here. They had not been attacked. They had not fallen ill. But something had changed. A thinning between worlds. A silence that was not empty, but full of watching eyes. Not hostile, not welcoming, only waiting. On the final night of October, the colony rested under a thin moon. Fires flickered low. The wind stirred the leaves with long, slow fingers. Somewhere beyond the reach of lantern light, a fox called out, a long, drawn sound that faded into nothing, and the shadows listened. By mid-autumn, the colony at Roanoke had grown quiet in new ways, not the quiet of sleep, not the peaceful silence of a fire dying down, but a different kind of quiet, layered, listening, unresolved. The kind that settles over a place when something is missing, but no one can quite say what it is. There were no clear signs of danger, no raids, no illness, no famine, and yet something in the rhythm had begun to shift, not loudly, only a little, and then a little more. It began with the spoons. One morning a family noticed that 2 of their wooden kneading spoons, hand-carved, simple, marked with small notches, were missing. It was a small thing, easy to overlook. Children misplace things. Animals carry objects away. The wind does curious things on the island, but the spoons were not found. The family carved replacements. Life went on. But a few days later, another settler, Thomas Bird, a quiet man known for keeping to himself, reported a similar loss. A knife. Small, bone-handled. He too searched. He too found nothing. And so it began. A slow pattern, minor items, small tools, a spool of thread, a wooden comb, a single child's shoe, left by the fire one evening, simply gone. No theft could be proven, no tracks found, no witnesses, only the gentle, persistent disappearance of the everyday. Then came the footprints. It was Anne Dare who first noticed them. Just after dawn, she stepped outside with Virginia in her arms. The sun had not yet reached above the trees, and the air still held the damp chill of night. Near the garden, just at the edge of the tilled soil, she saw them. Small, unshod, 5 toes, but not the size of any child in the colony, too narrow, too long, and too deep in the soft ground. She bent to look. The prints curved slightly, as if the figure had paused, pivoted, and turned back toward the forest. She said nothing to the others for several hours. Then, over the midday meal, she quietly asked if anyone had been out walking before sunrise. No one had. That night she slept lightly, but the prince did not return. Not there, not yet. Sleep had always come easily to most of the colonists. The days were long, the work physical, the evenings quiet, but now sleep seemed different. It came later, rested less deeply, and when it came, it brought strange dreams. Some told of walking through fog too thick to see, with voices whispering just out of reach. Others dreamed of familiar places, homes in England, old churches, childhood kitchens, made strange by sudden silences or shifting shadows. A few saw figures, never quite clearly, standing at a distance, watching. Governor White, though he rarely spoke of his own inner life, began recording his dreams in the margins of a sketchbook. "I dreamed of the forest," he wrote, "but the trees were not trees. They were pillars, hollow, and they sang." He never showed the entry to anyone, but others dreamed too. And though they rarely discussed it, they began to greet each other in the mornings with longer glances, searching faces for echoes of the night. Water was precious. The colony's well, dug deep at the edge of the clearing, had served them faithfully since their arrival. It was cool, clean, and slow to draw dry, even in the heat. But one morning, the water smelled different. Not foul, not spoiled, just changed. An earthy scent, a bitterness at the back of the throat like iron or wet stone. John White had the bucket tested. They boiled water. They fetched water from the stream instead. 2 days later, the scent was gone, and the water returned to its former self. But from that day on, many drank more sparingly. They trusted the well a little less, and they did not speak about it after sundown. Margaret Hayes was gathering firewood near the shore when she saw the first one. A figure, small, no more than a child's height, built entirely of driftwood and vines, tied at the joints, standing upright in a shallow pool at low tide. It had no face, no carvings, no decoration, just arms outstretched. She thought at first it might be a child's game, or a marker left by the Croatoan, though it resembled none of their known customs. By the next morning it was gone, swept away by tide perhaps. But 3 days later, another appeared. This one, farther inland, propped upright near the path to the stream. Still faceless, still bound. The settlers removed it, burned it. Then a third was found, this time inside the tree line. After that they stopped burning them. They left them alone, and slowly they stopped discussing them altogether. Manteo had not returned in weeks. Neither had any of the Croatoan. The absence, once a curiosity, now felt permanent. John White sent a small party south toward Hatteras, with hopes of re-establishing contact. They returned 2 days later, tired, damp, and with no answers. The villages were empty, not destroyed, not abandoned, simply still. Fires cold, shelters intact, tools set aside as if to later use, but no people, as if the island had swallowed them whole. White recorded the event in his journal. All that was human is now hushed. I felt as though we stepped into memory, not place. They returned to Roanoke with quiet steps, and even quieter thoughts. The weather turned again, but this time without storm or wind. The air simply began to move differently. Breezes came from the south when they should have come from the west. The smell of the sea faded earlier in the day, replaced by a kind of blankness, as though scent itself had withdrawn. Campfires no longer rose straight. Their smoke curled oddly, moving sideways, then down, then up again, spiraling. Some called it superstition. Others said nothing at all. But a few began sleeping with charms by their doors, tokens gifted by the Croatoan earlier in the season, now clutched like promises against unseen tides. One night, just after moonrise, a woman named Eliza heard a voice. She'd gone to the shore to rinse linens in the cool shallows, a task she often saved for the quiet hours. As she worked, she heard a soft, high sound. Not a cry, not a bird, a voice, calling her name. She turned, but no one was there. The sound came again, farther away yet clear, not panicked, not pleading, just calling. Eliza stood motionless for several minutes, the linen trailing from her hand like seaweed in the tide. Eventually the sound faded. She returned to the settlement, spoke to no one. But the next morning she tied a red ribbon around the door of her home and did not leave it for 2 days. John White found the paper under his sleeping mat. It was folded but not sealed, blank on one side. The other contained a single line written in faint charcoal. "They are not where you left them." He read it 3 times. He asked no one about it. He showed it to no one. That evening, he burned it over the hearth and sat silently for a long time, watching the ash drift into the dark. By the end of the month, the colony still stood. The homes still stood. The people still worked. They planted, they cooked. They whispered lullabies to their children at night. But the space between them had changed. not with hostility, but with hush. They spoke less in the evenings. They gathered closer to the fires. They watched the trees more than they watched each other, and always, beneath every step, behind every closed door, in every breath before sleep, was the sense that something was listening, something was nearby, not cruel, not kind, only present, waiting. And in the distance the wind continued to move in strange directions. The moon hung low that night, pale, wide, watching. It made no sound. It asked no questions. But it saw everything. Leadership, like the land, does not always announce itself. It settles quietly, like a tide rising in the grass, slow, persistent, shaping things by the inch rather than by the flood. At Roanoke, leadership did not come from banners or crowns. There was no governor's mansion, no soldiers to enforce law. There were only people, a clearing, and time. And at the centre of this quiet circle stood Governor John White, a man with ink on his hands and weight in his chest. John White had never sought authority in the traditional sense. Before Roanoke, he had lived a life more comfortable with ink than with iron. A cartographer by training, an artist by habit, a father and grandfather, but not a general. His earlier journey to the New World in 1585 had given him a familiarity with the land. He had drawn its coastlines, mapped its rivers, sketched its people. He'd seen both beauty and brutality there, and he returned home with a reverence for both. When he was appointed governor of this new colony, it was not because of charisma, nor because of conquest. It was trust. Trust from Raleigh. Trust from those who believed that a man who could observe the world carefully might also care for it wisely. But leadership is not made of observation alone, and in the long hush of the mid-season, that trust began, gently, quietly, to shift. There was no official council table in Roanoke, no round oak centrepiece or heraldic banners, only a long board of pine, held up by stones, shaded under a lean-to. A place where decisions were weighed, and voices, however soft, were heard. 6 men gathered there most often. John White, of course. Thomas Stevens, formerly a trader, quiet but keen. Elias Broadnax, a former sailor, broad-shouldered, with a practical mind and a steady rhythm of speech. Francis Littleton, the colony's nominal clerk who kept sparse notes, his handwriting tight and anxious. Richard Chapman, older, with a face like worn leather, who had once been a constable in England and still walked as if he carried authority in his boots. And Manteo, when he came. He had not been seen in many days. His absence was felt more than acknowledged. The first disagreements were not loud. No shouting, no accusations, no slammed fists. Only pauses. Long silences between words. A shift in where men looked when they spoke. When the matter of supplies was raised, Francis suggested rationing. Bread was running low. Salted meats had not arrived in the quantities expected. John nodded, but delayed the decision. He believed the next ship would come soon. Elias raised a brow. "Hope is not a plan," he said, but gently. They moved on. When the topic turned to outreach, whether to send another party south to seek the Croatoan, Thomas advised caution. They did not know what had happened there. Chapman disagreed. He believed silence was more dangerous than contact. John White again deferred. He listened, always. But sometimes he did not act. He wanted more information, more time. He wanted above all to avoid harm. But the colony did not run on patience alone, and slowly others began to act without asking. There were no official factions at Roanoke, but if you stood quietly near the fire at night, you might hear certain names spoken more often. Some trusted John White implicitly. They saw in him a calm hand, a thoughtful guide. Others looked to Chapman, older, firmer, more decisive. Still others found themselves listening to Elias, who walked the perimeter each evening and shared quiet reassurances with those he passed. And beneath it all, the whisper line grew. Soft exchanges, small rumours, not of mutiny, not of rebellion, but of doubt. The kind that curls in the corners of shared glances. The kind that settles in the space between questions. In the final week of October, John White sat beneath the stars and began a letter to Sir Walter Raleigh. He wrote slowly, by firelight on a single sheet of parchment. To our patron and protector in London, the colony persists, though with a growing stillness. The land is unchanged, yet we sense something unfamiliar. I worry not for weather, nor for enemy, but for time itself. There is a change I cannot name. He paused there, listened to the wind, and did not finish. The letter was folded but not sealed. It remained in his journal unsent. The candle beside him burned low and sputtered in the damp. Among the settlers, religion held a gentle place. They prayed together on Sundays. They sang hymns, slow and sweet, beneath the open sky. A Bible sat on a stone ledge beneath a crude cross made of driftwood. But by late autumn, the tone had shifted. Some began to pray more privately, others less at all. Margaret Hayes began lighting candles at dusk, not for ceremony, but for comfort. Eliza, the woman who had heard the voice, began weaving crosses of reed and hanging them in the trees near her home. When asked, she simply said, "It keeps the dreams away." No one argued, and that was the change, not belief, but the need for permission. People no longer asked what was right. They did what felt safe. Elias Broadnax began making a second map, not of the coast, not of the rivers, but of the settlement itself. He marked where people slept, where they kept tools, which families spoke often, and which had grown quiet. It was not a map for navigation, but for observation. He did not share it, but he kept it updated daily. In his quiet, deliberate way, Elias was preparing for something. He did not say what. But some began to notice that he no longer left his boots by the door when he slept. At the next council gathering, Thomas Stevens raised a question. What if the governor returns to England? The statement landed like a soft stone in a pond. No splash, just ripples. It is not an accusation, not a demand, only a possibility. If resupply is to come, someone must ask for it, Thomas continued. And if we're to send word, should it not be you? White looked down at his hands. He said nothing for a full minute. Then he said, "Not yet." The others nodded and said no more. But something had shifted. The suggestion had been made, and it would not be forgotten. That evening, Richard Chapman walked the entire perimeter of the settlement. He stopped at each house, spoke with each family, not long, not loudly. He asked about water, about tools, about how they slept. He did not carry a weapon, but he did carry something else. Certainty. Chapman had no desire to challenge White, but if the time came, he wanted to be ready. And the people, though they did not say it, slept a little more easily knowing someone had walked the edge. At the centre of the colony, the communal fire burned low that night. People gathered, as they always did, but their voices were softer, their laughter rarer. John White sat beside the flame, sketchbook closed, eyes distant. He thought of Eleanor, asleep with her child. He thought of Manteo, and of what he might say if he returned. He thought of Raleigh, across the sea, and whether his absence now felt like abandonment. He thought of England, of pine needles, of spoons, and of the note he had burned. Then he stood and quietly stirred the fire, not to brighten it, only to keep it alive. Leadership in this strange new land was not a crown or a command. It was a fire watched through the night, and a silence shared by those who remained. Departure is rarely loud. It is not the moment a door closes or a ship sails. It begins earlier, in the slow build of unspoken thoughts, in the measured looks between people who used to speak freely. In the soft but persistent accumulation of decisions deferred, supplies dwindling, and voices gone quiet with waiting. By the time Governor John White agreed to return to England, the colony had already started to feel like it was holding its breath. This was not the kind of leaving that felt like an escape. It was a surrender to the inevitable, dressed in the clothes of duty, and the cost would weigh far heavier than the distance it required. It was late autumn when the talk of departure began again. The days had grown shorter, the wind colder, cutting through the trees with the dry sound of rustling leaves and the occasional creak of a drying bough. White had begun pacing more in the evenings, walking alone near the edges of the settlement. He would stop to look at the water, his hand resting on a small leather-bound notebook. He rarely wrote in it now, but he carried it always. Inside, there were maps and sketches, some of the surrounding coast, others of the settlers, including drawings of his daughter Eleanor and infant Virginia. The colony was quieter than it had ever been. There was no longer the daily bustle of hammering or clearing. The gardens had been harvested. The barrels of salted fish sat half full. Wood had been stacked for the colder nights ahead, but none of the labour had its old sense of building toward something. It was maintenance now, survival. And the silence that filled the air was not peace. It was the silence of waiting for something that refused to come. John White had called the remaining councillors together. They sat beneath the lean-to near the edge of the common space, where the wind was gentler and the low sun cast long shadows across the pine-needled ground. Francis Littleton had already made up his mind. If we are to last the winter, we need more than hope and good fortune, he said plainly. We are running out of powder. Our nets have torn. We've seen no new deer for weeks. Chapman, with arms folded and boots still dusty from his patrol of the woods that morning, nodded slowly. It's not about failure, he said. It's about time. We've waited as long as we can. Even Elias Broadnax, usually content to watch and listen, finally spoke. The people will not say it, he said. But they are watching the water more than the sky. They no longer believe help is coming. White listened. He didn't argue. He only asked one question. If I leave, do you believe I'll be allowed to return? There was a long pause. Chapman finally answered, If you're not, we'll do our best. But yes, we believe you must try. That night he did not sleep. That evening Eleanor found her father by the fire. She had known he would be there, as he always was when thoughts became too heavy for walls. She carried Virginia with her, swaddled tightly in a blanket stitched from what remained of the old English linens they'd brought with them. The child was asleep, her tiny chest rising and falling like the sea. Eleanor sat down without speaking. The two watched the fire for some time, the wood crackling gently. Finally she spoke. So you've decided. White didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on the flames. I don't want to go. I know, but it may be the only way. I know that too. He turned to look at her then. She was young, but the lines at the corners of her eyes had grown deeper since they'd landed. Not from age, but from worry. From watching too many days go by without answers. What if I don't come back? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor placed a hand gently on her daughter's back. Then we will remember that you tried. Word of the governor's departure passed through the colony not like news, but like a shift in the wind. Everyone had sensed it before it was said aloud. Some came quietly to offer well wishes. Others avoided White entirely, too unsure of what to say. A few were visibly anxious. How long? One man asked. How long do we wait? As long as we must, White answered. It wasn't the answer the man wanted, but it was the only one he could give. Eliza, who had long avoided conversation since the strange voices by the shore, approached White with a small woven charm, twine and bark and bone, tied into a knot meant to protect travellers. She said nothing, just pressed it into his hand, then turned and left. There was no ceremony, no farewell meal, no official gathering, just preparation. The vessel that would carry him away was small, a pinnace, a light boat with a single mast and a shallow hull, barely more than a shell of wood and tar, its sail patched with old canvas. It would take him north first, up the coast to attempt rendezvous with English ships or fishing vessels, and from there, back across the Atlantic, if the weather allowed, if he could find passage, if he wasn't captured by the Spanish or left behind entirely. It was an if tied to every plank, but it was the only path they had left. He took only a small pack, his notebook, a compass, some dried meat, and Eleanor's last drawing, Virginia asleep beneath the cedar tree. The morning of his departure dawned grey. No sun, just a soft layer of cloud like wool pulled across the sky. The tide was low, the air still. A few settlers gathered near the water, not to send him off, but because they couldn't help but watch. Chapman walked with him to the shore, said little, simply placed a firm hand on White's shoulder before turning back. Francis Littleton gave him a tightly wrapped packet of letters, some meant for loved ones back in England, some simply prayers. Thomas Stevens said only, "Return. Soon." Eleanor stood near the trees holding Virginia. White met her eyes. He raised a hand, so did she, and then he stepped into the boat. The boat rocked gently as Spicer and Palfrey pushed off with long poles. White sat at the front, facing the land. The settlement grew smaller, the trees thinner, the outline of the watchtower blurred against the morning haze, and then they were moving, slowly but steadily, out toward the bend. He kept his eyes on the tree where Eleanor had stood, but she was gone now, swallowed by the stillness. The sound of the oars filled the air. Nothing else, no wind, no voices, just the sound of moving water and a quiet, gnawing thought. What if this was the last time? They did not speak much that first night. Spicer tended the sail. Palfrey checked the compass again and again, though the stars had not changed. White lay awake, his cloak pulled tight, his eyes on the sky. It had been 23 years since he'd first seen these waters. Then it had been wonder, adventure. Now it was weight, responsibility, unanswered questions. Each wave seemed to whisper back the faces he'd left behind. He sketched by moonlight, trees, maps, his daughter's eyes. But the page never held them quite right, and eventually he stopped trying. White would not return quickly. Storms would slow them. Ports would close. The war with Spain would turn every ship toward home defence. By the time he reached England, he found the Queen's ships too few, her attention fixed elsewhere. White wrote letters, pleaded with Raleigh, spoke before merchants and the court, but no one had time, no one had ships. Years would pass before he could even try to return, and all the while, the memory of that grey morning, the tree line, the silence, would replay again and again in his mind. And on Roanoke's shore life would go on, strangely, quietly, incompletely. Some days Eleanor would walk to the edge of the water, Virginia on her hip. She would stare out into the empty sea, not in hope, not in grief, but in stillness, a waiting that had no end date. Some nights the settlers would still light a fire near the shore just in case a sail appeared on the horizon. And slowly, in the absence of new supplies, new orders, or new faces, the colony would have to become something else. They would leave signs, they would make plans, but those too belong to another chapter. And for now, we end with a boat moving away and the hush it leaves behind. Departure is not a conclusion, it is a question set afloat, and all that remains is to wait for the answer. In silence, words take on the weight of absence. A letter not sent leaves a space where meaning once might have lived. It becomes that quiet thing tucked between pages, waiting for a response that will never come. And so, on the island of Roanoke, those letters, sent and unsent, became harbours of memory, of grief, of love unspoken, and hope held in quiet recess. Eleanor woke early, before dawn's grey rose to pale blue. She crossed the clearing toward the vine-covered wall where she had once marked children's chalk games. There, beneath a low window, she unfolded a simple note, the last she had written to her father. The paper had faded, the ink run soft from damp air, but the words remained legible. Father. Last night, Virginia reached for the moonlight on her blankets. She smiles sometimes, but the sound is missing. She stomachs her feedings, but the hunger in her eyes grows. I write to you not for answers, but to remember you, and to ask that you return. I will wait beneath the cedar. Your daughter, Eleanor. She pressed the letter to her chest and traced each word, each curve of ink as though mapping a memory. She did not fold it again. She placed it carefully beneath a rock by the window, a quiet plea set in stone. Inside her small cabin, Eleanor collected scraps of cloth, a ribbon from a gown, a piece of sash woven with orange thread, Virginia's bonnet once tied with lace, now frayed. She kept them in a jar, a fragmentary archive of home. One evening she wrote a brief note. These cloths smell of sea, of pine, of my mother's closet back in England. I hold them so that Virginia might smell something like safety, like memory. She left the note beside the jar. At dawn she found the jar open. Inside lay 3 feathers, 2 pale, 1 dark. No note, no explanation. Only the weight of the feathers and the silence between them. Francis Littleton, the colony clerk, wrote dozens of small index cards. Each card carried a list: bread, salted pork, beans, clothing, seeds, crossed out slowly over days, then weeks. One card, never sent, carried a final plea. We're running out of food. We cannot fish enough. The island's silence muffles life. If no ships come, we will fade. He buried the cards beneath loose stones by the well. Later, Margaret Hayes found them and burned them. When she offered the ashes to Littleton, he only nodded. No letter would come, no hope would arrive, only the quiet erosion of supplies. The colony had a healer, a man named John Everard. One entry in his journal read, "The baby's cough lingers, though no fever visits her. Eleanor fears she hears whispered voices in the night, though I hear none. Still, the child's sleep is fitful. I fear the land unsettles her spirit." He wrote that inside his tent, after Virginia's cries wove through his dreams. The pages smelled faintly of tea and herbs. The entry ended, "If only I could send this note south, to the Croatoan. Perhaps their wisdom might soothe her." But he never packed the journal. It stayed behind, like a prayer, unspoken. One afternoon, Anne Dare placed a folded slip at the base of an old oak. It was meant for Manteo, should he ever return. "You taught me to plant beans with squash, to read the signs of birds. I plant them still, though the birds have gone. I plant them in your honour, and in the hope that you might walk here again. No envelope, no seal, only the tree, and the hope that wind or roots might carry the message." Months later the paper was gone. Was it carried by breeze, eaten by insects, taken by someone unseen? No one knew. Only the oak stood, silent, as if holding on to memory. Virginia Dare had begun to draw. Her crayon drawings were simple. Lines on bark scraps, a house, a figure beside a tree, a boat floating, not in water, but in space between 2 lines. One night she pressed a drawing into Eleanor's hand. "I drew you sailing away. You are going back." "Please come back too," she said, pointing at the blank line beneath the boat. Eleanor pressed the bark softly to her lips. She carried the drawing to the door and tucked it beneath a plank. She did not show it to the others. She did not speak of it aloud, but at night she looked for it there, pressed between wood and earth, as though expecting the line beneath the boat to be filled in one day. Far away, in England, John White had hidden a compass given by Chapman in his quarters. He wrote to Raleigh, I carry this compass worn at my wrist. It is the only thing that's seen both shores. I think of Roanoke when I hold it, and of home. But correspondence delayed. By the time a response came, the ink had faded. White tucked the letter inside his coat and placed the compass upon his desk. Neither reached their destination. One remained tucked in the crook of his arm as he waited months for passage. The other remained unplucked from ledger pages, two relics of a promise undone. One evening, several colonists sat near the hearth. Margaret Hayes, Francis Littleton, and Elias Broadnax shared what they called a poem of home, lines from an English verse. Beyond the hills of green and seas of blue, my heart returns where grasses sway true. They composed their own version. Beyond the pines of Roanoke, beyond the hush of Oyster Creek, may wind bring word and bring him home. They wrapped the manuscript and placed it in the centre of the hearth, hoping that ashes would carry it near. Instead, it remained undisturbed, as if spoken too quietly to leave the page. They burned other papers that night. Not the poem. It remained, folded beside the fire, a small beacon in fading hope. One late November evening, Eleanor wrote a final letter. Not for her father, not for anyone. Instead, she wrote to the place itself. Roanoke, you held us softly. You taught us beans and bird song and earth's rhythm. And then you grew quiet. We stayed, though we did not always belong. Our footsteps fade in your grass now. But remember us when you speak to the wind. Remember that we came in hope, in patience, in memory. Yours, the Lost Colony. She pinned it to the shared gathering board with a nail made of bent copper. It remained there, tucked between two beams, until spring rains washed it away, leaving only the nail. No letters flew across the ocean. No replies crossed the water. What remains were fragments, movements of thought, papers left behind. But in those scraps lay the beating heart of memory. Eleanor's plea beneath the cedar, Virginia's drawing of a boat, Francis's ledger of empty barrels, Anne's offering at the oak, John White's compass, a poem burned into quiet ash. These were the messages that passed beneath the canopy. They did not carry urgency. They did not carry answers. They mostly carried silence. But they carried something precious. The lived presence of people not yet gone, their whispers on paper, their longing pressed into ink and line, their pause between hope and disappearance. No letter ever reached England, no reply ever crossed the sea. Only the quiet weight of words unsent, and the sound of wind whispering through empty rooms. In the hush of absence, stories gather. They collect like morning dew, drop there casually, refreshed by quiet reflection. What happened to Roanoke? Not a question for the shout of historians or the flourish of grand tales, but a whisper, soft, patient, open to possibility. Doesn't fear one answer more than another, honours each in its own stillness. One theory rises in light and memory, that the colonists did not perish, but became something else, walking south or east into Croatoan territory, seeking kinship and survival, blending into canoes, village life, woven cloth, cultivated maize. That the English did not vanish, but changed, because the land demanded adaptation. Think of Manteo, who once crossed into England, learning their ways, sharing stories, and imagine the colonists weaving the same memory in reverse, adopting Croatoan names, new paths, different rhythms. They would not disappear. They would reappear in daily work, in village songs, in shared meals, in laughter both unfamiliar and warmly known, not ghosts, not memories, but a new kind of presence. Another idea. The colonists packed their few supplies and stepped quietly into the forest, toward clearer fields, toward streams unseen, toward tribes less observed, that they walked inland in small groups, seeking better soil, longer rivers, stronger alliances. Perhaps they found homes among tribes in what is now North Carolina or Virginia, living, farming, drifting with trade. No burning of homes, no waving of white flags. Just footsteps fading softly under pine needles. Footprints that dissolved with autumn rains. They did not vanish. They merely learned new ways of being, with new people under new skies. Disease is seldom dramatic at first. Often it arrives in silence. A cough, a fever held back by prayer and broth. A child sleeping longer than usual. An elder weak at the hearth. This theory holds that the colonists fell, slowly, quietly, under illnesses they did not understand. Smallpox carried by birds, typhus spread from village to village, or a common epidemic that had taken the Sea-Catan earlier, now drifting through new bodies. The colony dwindled as gardens failed and hunting waned, not in fire or sword, but in the laboured breath of illness. Their last days quiet, their last moments unseen. And when they faded, the land filled the spaces they left behind. Another possibility is more sombre, but still quiet. Not warfare of flames and blood, but tension that turned inward. A misunderstanding at a meeting. A tool misplaced and blamed. A security patrol that took a wrong turn through Croatoan fields. A canoe unseen at dusk carrying men of another tribe into the settlement. Perhaps a child screamed. Word spread. Fear surfaced. Not enough to start a battle, but enough to close a door. A relocation south, not in safety but in retreat, away from neighbours whose trust had cracked. Leaving behind cabins, clothes, journals. Not in peace, but not in violence either. Just necking away from possible danger. The presence of Spain in the 1580s cast a long, slow shadow. English settlements were suspect. Spanish fishermen passed these waters. Spanish ships of war hunted these coasts. So perhaps Roanoke never disappeared at all. Perhaps its people were lost in a covert raid, a quick boarding in the night. Their names taken, their gear seized, some taken prisoner, others harvested in secret. It was not epic war, not banners saluted, only a quiet crime on a coastal dawn, a theft of presence, and then silence. In the years after Roanoke fell silent, other travellers told of English among native villages. Occasional reports reached archaeologists much later, of pale men, strange clothes, English words. These stories were dismissed, fanciful, improbable. But in hush, they linger. A child heard singing Elizabethan rhyme, a woman remembering smallpox and tendering English names. Not proof, but possibility. Echoes left behind, footprints on the margins of memory. Not illusions, but outlines. I lean into these theories not to resolve the mystery, but to respect its shape, to honour each possibility, because each holds a truth, each carries a sense of paths diverged, paths unchosen, paths travelled without final return, and each, in its own way, reflects how a people might dissolve into new beginnings, or fade into illness, or walk away from danger. There is no right answer, but there are many dignified ways to have ended, to have changed. There is no epic finale, no dramatic scene under fallen walls, no cavalry charge, no plague sweeping through the clearing in cinematic fashion. Instead, fade-outs, walking away, sickness unseen, quiet disturbance in the forest, tribes choosing caution, no sudden curtain falling, but days passing, days shaped by small choices, small voices, small departures. If you listen to the theories too close, they seem distant. But from a gentle remove, they hold depth. They ask us, what does it mean to disappear? Not violently, not entirely, but softly. What does it mean to change? To join a different life? To remain, but not where we started? To vanish, but not fully? These are not shadows to chase away. They are strangers to sit beside, to listen to their possibilities. It's possible, after all this, that no one lost. Perhaps some survived. Perhaps others adapted. Perhaps a few carved a simple life among new neighbours. Perhaps many died. We do not know. But even in absence, even in legendary silence, there is a quiet victory of life lived, choices made, steps taken. It may not be grand, it may be unseen, it may even be forgotten the grasses, but it mattered. And in the hush of history that is enough. Roanoke remains a question more than an answer, and so we let its mystery settle like fallen leaves. Let its silence speak, if we listen closely, and understand that endings, like beginnings, are most honoured in quiet reverence. The story of Roanoke did not end with the departure of colonists. It lingered, not only in missing cabins or lost tools, but in the quiet spaces between memory and forgetting, like a half-heard lullaby, a name traced on an old parchment, a forest waiting for footsteps that never came back. And so these whispers, soft and persistent, still move through time. The trees of Roanoke still stand, pines stretching skyward, palmettos arching low, vines twisting along trunks. Walkers today, if they know where to look, can still sense the shape of the old clearing. They might hear wind swaying like a breath. They might find uneven ground, slightly raised where a cabin's foundation once sat. They might stand beneath a cedar and feel the hush of history. No markers, no crowds, only the land itself, holding memory. Centuries later, archaeologists began to dig slowly. They came with tools small and careful, trowels instead of bulldozers. They brushed away earth. They found shards of pottery, nails rusted by salt, charcoal from old hearths, not signs of battle, but signs of life lived, meals prepared, garments worn, maps drawn. Each fragment, a whisper of people who once turned earth into home. They didn't rush. They didn't cast judgment. They worked because memory asks for attention, even if only in small pieces. Jars of fragments sit in glass cases. Maps drawn by John White on folded paper. A single copper nail still gleaming. Sandals estimated to be 16th century. These objects are not trophies, they are testimonies. They sit in hushed rooms, under careful lights, where visitors lean in and hold their breaths at the distance and closeness of loss. Each artifact joins voices across centuries, speaking without shout, teaching without demand, reminding us that people's lives mattered, even when they slipped away. Roanoke's story fed the river of folklore, whispers of white Indians, pale children singing Elizabethan rhymes, stories of Englishmen seen trading with indigenous villagers decades later. Skepticism met these stories, but they endure. They endure because sparks of memory refuse to be doused. They suggest possibility, that some part of the colonists survived, not in full, but in fragments, in DNA, in traditions passed quietly, in words that refuse to disappear. The word Croatoan carved into wood. Letters cut deep and clear, both promise and puzzle. Was that where they went? Was it an instruction, or a name they left behind, and then moved on? That one word still haunts the story, because it was left on a tree, not on paper, not on stone, but in the living, breathing bark of a tree. It spoke to both hope and uncertainty, and it lingers still in our memory. There are no grand monuments, not really. No domed mausoleum, no shining statue, only simple markers, small plaques, still with nothing but the name, Roanoke. Somewhere, on the island, someone stands and listens, hearing the echoes of children's footsteps, the low song of someone calling a tool, a lullaby for a sleeping child. That echo is the legacy, not loud, but singularly true. Roanoke's story is taught now in schools. It speaks of colonization, of hope, of indigenous presence. It speaks of unfinished stories and of perspectives that matter and many that were lost. It's used as a prompt for classrooms to ask, what do we remember? Whose voices were recorded? Whose were erased? Roanoke becomes a whisper that grows louder with education, its quiet echoes opening conversations. Today you can walk on the sand. You can stand where the fort once stood. The air is calm, the sun gentle. A breeze stirs the pines. Tourists come, students come. They carry cameras. They step lightly. They stand in hush. Some imagine, some draw, some lay hands on driftwood. And they listen for history. Not the shouting kind, but the whispering kind. Loss is not always end, not always emptiness. When Roanoke's people left, or died, or moved on, they did so in ways we can only guess. They did not leave stories behind. They left traces, and so their absence is still presence, a paradox held in time, and now we, centuries later, hold it in ours, even if we can't name it fully. In the hush of 13 centuries of wind, in the scattered remains of post holes and nails, in the ink left on paper by John White, in the berries grown by indigenous hands, that's where Roanoke lives, not in answers, but in questions, not in endings, but in the quiet that follows absence, a space for listening, for respect, for wonder. Roanoke is not a footnote. It is a silence we are still learning to hear. It is a space between beginnings and endings, and in its hush, we may learn to listen again. We've walked the long shoreline of Roanoke, stepped through low brush where homes once stood, listened to the wind that moves between languages, between memory and forgetting. And now we find ourselves at the edge of the story, not its end exactly, but the place where words grow quiet, where pages turn slower, where we simply sit beside all that we do not know. They came with hope, with worry packed beside salted pork, with tools and paper and dreams sewn into their sleeves. They were never just a mystery, they were people, mothers, farmers, children learning to walk. They were listeners and builders and dreamers. What became of them may never be known, but who they were, that still matters. And always will. Some stories end in answers, some stories end in echoes. Roanoke gave us the latter. It left a door open, not closed, a name carved on wood, a path not taken, a question that still waits at the edge of the Atlantic. That kind of ending is not a failure. It is a gift, a reminder that not all mysteries must be solved. Some must simply be honoured. Perhaps the deepest way we remember them is not with noise, but with attention, with stillness, with the simple act of listening to a story whose resolution was carried away by wind and tide, and here into what remains, not in certainty, but in care. At night, the waves of Roanoke still whisper, over dunes, through driftwood, across the foundation stones left behind. They whisper of footfalls and farewells, of firelight against cabin walls, of canoes arriving from the south, of letters carved into bark. They ask nothing, they offer only quiet company. And so you, dear listener, carry this story now, not to solve it, but to keep it, to carry it gently as a reminder that even in silence there is legacy. Even in disappearance there is meaning. Even in stillness there is a history worth holding close. The colony may be gone, but it's not lost. It lives in questions, in soil, in song, in memory, in you. Thank you for spending this time with us, for listening to a story long forgotten, and for letting it breathe again, if only for a little while. If you enjoyed this slow journey into the quiet past, I invite you to stay a little longer by subscribing to Obscure Chronicle. There are more stories ahead, more mysteries to unfold, more moments of stillness to share. Until next time, rest well, and may history keep whispering softly wherever you are.